Well, Jordan, welcome to the Best Business Minds. I'm excited to talk about your book that's right behind you. And so let's get started by telling us a little bit about your background.
Well, I grew up in a New York City housing project. By the way, pleasure to be here, Mark. I grew up in a New York City housing project that was built for returning war veterans. And so, really among working class people, very straight communication. And I grew up in a family that was loud by New York standards. So I really developed a very direct communication style. My first occupation was really as a therapist. And then I kind of shifted into leadership and management. And part of what happened to me was I always got feedback that I was abrasive, and that had to do with my directness. And then later on, I became the chief operations officer of a healthcare company, which we grew from 4 employees to 65 and sold to a large insurance company. And then I got fired. And I wasn't bright enough to realize that my style, which worked in a fast-growing entrepreneurial company, would not work in an insurance company. And so I got some feedback about my style, and I realized that I needed to change. And so since then, I have become a master corporate executive coach, and I work with similar executives with similar issues.
So I can relate to that issue, Jordan, because I'm very direct as well. And sometimes I can be abrasive, but I think it rarely ever happens. Why did you write this book?
Well, about 3 years ago, I don't know about you, but I'm getting old. And about 3 years ago, I realized that, I'm sort of hitting a new life stage, and what do I want to do? And there was a big part of me that feels like the conversation in leadership these days about abrasiveness is somewhat slanted. So I have a different perspective. One is that a lot of executives who get called abrasive, bully, whatever, really don't want to hurt people. It's really partly their culture. They come from loud cultures, and partly they're just so driven to be successful that they get frustrated and defensive when people don't perform. And we have all of these people who refer to them by names like bully, jerk, and a few body parts. And it really sort of annoyed me. I thought it was hypocritical. So I really wrote the book to change the conversation about what abrasiveness is. And let me be clear, it's not okay to be disrespectful and bullying and all of that stuff, but there is a conversation that needs to happen about what's happening in our society. So it was really about that.
How do you define abrasive?
Well, abrasive is partly culturally defined. So I have a business partner who grew up in his mother is Mexican, his father was Dutch, and they yelled a lot, like my family. We get on the phone, and my wife would listen to us and say, I keep thinking you're going to, quit the partnership. And somehow by the end, you guys are, made up, and you're thanking each other for the input. And so there's a piece of that. My response to that is, nah, we were just talking. So there's a piece of that, but there's also, let's take it a little further, using profanity, defaming people in public, embarrassing them, all of that kind of stuff. And whether it gets experienced as abrasive or not is really partly in the mind of the perceiver and the culture of the organization.
So in the book, it says that there are 4 types of bullshit leaders, no bullshit leaders. And I love the title.
Thank you.
What are the 4 types?
Well, the first type is the warrior. And the warrior is the master. The warrior is completely focused on results. And very rarely are they disrespectful. It's usually about whatever your behavior or performance was. And they have very, very high expectations. The second group I call the scientists. And those are people who are very analytic. Typically they're introverted, which means that they don't have a lot of energy for interpersonal relationships. They may only have one or two close relationships in their life, and as they're walking down the hall, they don't see why they should waste time saying good morning to everyone. And those folks are often experienced as not available, and if the people who are around them have shaky self-esteem, they're experienced as disrespectful as well. The third group is probably the group I fell in. I call them the abrasive executive. And those are people, for the most part, who don't want to hurt people, but whose self-esteem is attached to success. So when the people around them don't perform, they feel personally attacked. And they may strike out, but it's really, you know, it sounds like they're attacking people, but it's really a defensive response. And then the fourth group I refer to as bully. It's a very small group. The estimate of what percentage of people in the general population are about 1 to 2%. My executive coaching people think that it's probably more like 10 to 15% in the executive suite. And they just enjoy hurting people, or they just don't care. It's about them, et cetera. So that would be the four kinds.
So I thought this was all very interesting. I like the research that you've done. Is one better suited for long-term success?
Well, certainly the warrior is the one that's better suited for long-term success and is less likely to get into difficulty in our current work environment. If the warrior gets complaints, often an independent third party investigates and finds out that the warrior did nothing that required the complaint. It's really the person who received it who needs to improve their performance. Both the scientist and the abrasive executive tend to be successful up until a certain point. And Marshall Goldsmith, one of my favorite authors, wrote a book called What Got You Here Won't Get You There. So their drive, the way that they go about things, and for the scientist, it's their analytic style. When they're working on projects and they're working on getting stuff out, their style tends to be tolerated, but when they get higher and it's more about relationship, they run into difficulty. My experience is that most of those people, if they get a good reason to change, certainly the abrasive executive often feels like the reason that they're getting pressure to change is that we live in an overly protective, overly politically correct, overly polite society, and that this is all a bunch of political bull. And they have to figure out that there's authentic reason for them to change. And my experience is most of the time that they do.
So has the younger generation, especially, you know, I'm 59, my kids are going to be 30 and 27, and their generation, everybody gets a trophy, everybody's made to feel good, everyone is asked about their feelings and so forth. Has that culture, that demographic become soft, or do we need to be, as leaders, much more attuned to how they're feeling about things? And that would actually maybe even improve their skill set and performance.
Well, not even just because of millennials and younger generation. I think that executives, particularly CEOs, have been told that their job is to make money for the shareholders, profit for the shareholders. And there has not been an emphasis until the last few years on developing relationship with the people who work for you, and with and certainly with customers and the society in general. So I think in general we need to get more aware of that. Are we overly protective? My gut tells me yes, but also part of what goes on with the younger generation is that they need to have motivation. They need to be part of something that they want to be part of. And our generation was raised, just do your work. It doesn't matter whether it means anything for you. So I think that's a shift in the positive direction.
Can you give 3 good examples of no bullshit leaders and what makes them special? You know, people might say.
Yeah, just so one of them, given what's going on today, one of my heroes is Martin Luther King. And he was totally focused on the goal. There was no giving up. He was never out of the fight. Or even if you look at I'm blocking on his first name, Senator Lucas or Congressman Lucas, who just passed.
Oh, John Lewis.
John Lewis,
Yes.
thank you.
Yeah.
That would be an example of a warrior, of a no bullshit executive. So another example to me would be Margaret Thatcher, or perhaps Ruth Bader Ginsburg, or a number of other folks. So they're out there.
Okay. Is this something learned or are you born with it?
I think my understanding is it's partly genetic, and because it has to do with, are you introverted, extroverted, are you highly planful versus are you whatever comes. All of that stuff impacts how you react to things. And it's also partly your family culture and the culture that you come from. So I think it's a combination of learned and probably genetic.
I've been watching a lot of documentaries since COVID started.
Yes.
And I think sports is something that we all relate to because it's out front. And lots of people like myself watch the Michael Jordan documentary.
Yes.
And I watched one on Kobe Bryant and watched one on Bill Belichick. And these guys are definitely fit in, I guess, the warrior no bullshit mode. But at the same time, they needed to have somebody balance them out. As Michael Jordan said, without Scottie Pippen, there are no 6 championships. And I think Scottie Pippen balanced him out. Is it important if you're a no bullshit leader to find somebody's kind of the opposite, you driven hard like you are, but a little bit softer side?
Well, yes. And let me answer that question in 2 ways. One way is it's never just about the leader. One person cannot drive. You have to be able to develop a team or even an organization that is committed to you as a person. So part of that is, do they see you as somebody that they like? Do they see you as somebody that they trust? And trust is very big. And ultimately, do they believe you? Are you credible? And so, I did watch that Michael Jordan series, and clearly he had a mixed reaction from people about liking him, but he was very, very strong in trust and credibility. And so it is important, the larger the organization gets, the more the leader has to focus on culture and on commitment and mission than just getting things done and telling people what to do.
I really enjoyed the Michael Jordan documentary and did not like him before the documentary and liked him more after the documentary. Because I could see that he was driven for success and he felt like if I don't really push these people to limit, they won't be ready in the playoffs. Right. And I know I've got other people like Bill Cartwright and Scottie Pippen, other people around me who will balance out how harsh I can be on them. Because if all of us are harsh like this, right, it probably is not going to go work out very well. And I think Steve Jobs had Steve Wozniak and Tim Cook, and that helped him. And I'm sure most all of these guys have somebody internally. I taught at Wharton for 10 years, and I had a couple of my students work for Ben Stiller and said it was a nightmare working for him, but his chief operating officer was such a good guy that he was the approachable one. That Ben Stiller would walk in, not even talk to him, look at him as if they were furniture. So it was kind of interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. I have a colleague who is a therapist, psychologist, who talks about that those kind of executives need to have somebody to delegate empathy to.
Yeah, right. You write in your book, is this in the book you write, what do you mean by the least you can do? What do you mean by that?
Well, the word has a double meaning. So the book is written to executives who get pushed to be more polite, politically correct, all of that. And I was essentially writing to people who had the same conversation in their head that I had when I was getting that pressure. So one of the meanings of the least you can do is literally the least you can do. So one of the things I say to them is, look, if you think that changing your style so that people aren't offended by you is just political garbage, then I want to show you the least you can do to protect yourselves in our politically correct environment. But there's also another meaning to the least you can do, which is it's the right thing to do. So in the book, I mentioned that if somebody who has a disability asks you to help them across the street and you get them to the other side, and then they offer to pay you, you would say, of course not. That was the least I could do. So part of what I'm saying to the people I'm talking to in the book is that if I do my job with you, you will decide that it's the least you can do, in the sense that it's the right thing to do to change your style, even though you're annoyed as hell by the demand to be more politically correct, more polite, more protective, all of that.
I think some of those people don't even realize they're being impolite. You know, they just feel that that direct conversation is something that would be really of value to people, not realize that sometimes they've gone too far.
Yeah, you're completely correct about that. And there are a couple of reasons for it. One is that, particularly if they're fairly senior, people don't want to tell them. So the reports are not going to tell them you're offensive. And sometimes the HR people or even their executives are a bit conflict avoidant. In addition, they're very valuable people. And there's concern that if we tell them that they're obnoxious and need to change, we might lose them. They might get angry. And so, and on top of that, they come from cultures where that kind of talk is just normal and they just think they're talking. So there's a number of reasons why they don't get it. I usually do anonymous interviews with their reports, with their peers, and feed that back to them. And almost 100% of the time, they are shocked when they hear the impact that they're having on people.
And those interviews are so valuable. I do the same thing with my clients too. And I had a CEO of a 100-person company, and he was shocked to hear all his direct reports said that they had to check his temperature before they told him anything.
Right.
And he thought he's calm and steady every day. And they said, no, you're highly emotionally driven.
Yeah.
So we didn't know, you know, we had to see if you're in a good mood or not. You say having a purpose is a key to getting over adversity. Talk about that.
Well, and I really say that in the sense of the people who are around them. So one of my, I'm going to make a very extreme example. One of my favorite books is by Viktor Frankl, Man's Search for Meaning. Viktor Frankl was a psychiatrist who had been in a German concentration camp. And his book was really, in a lot of ways, about what is it that what helps people survive something like that. And part of it was purpose. Oops, excuse me, I turn this down. Part of it is purpose. So there was an example that he gave of a man who had lost his wife in the concentration camp. And he came and he was depressed and he was miserable and suffering. And he said to Dr. Frankl something along the lines of, you know, what is life worth? Why am I doing this? And Dr. Frankl said to him, you know, how would your wife have handled being alone the way you are? And he said, well, that she would have been even worse. It would have been really horrible for her. And so he said something along the lines of, you know, so what you are doing is really protecting your wife from having to deal with that. So that's a very extreme example in terms of people who are legitimately, I'm going to turn that off, it just couldn't do it, who are legitimately getting abused in the workplace. One of the questions is, what do you have to learn? What's the opportunity? And often they are conflict avoidant, or their self-esteem is attached to whether or not people are talking to them nicely. And so they have to focus on having a purpose. What is the purpose? What can they get out of it that's positive in this situation?
Some of the things that we see in your book, you write about, why do some bullshit executives have esteem issues? Why do they have that? I think the president has that.
Yeah. Well, everybody has esteem issues. There may be a 0.5% of the population that doesn't. Mm-hmm. But again, I think it goes back to how do you deal with it? And it's partly culture, and it's partly how attacked do you feel? So for people with an uncommon desire for success, an uncommon need for success, accomplishing the mission, let's say. There are some people who are so committed to that they just don't feel good about themselves unless it happens. And not feeling good about themselves means they have failed. So it may be also another possibility is that they had parents who even were on the abusive side, and so they have some wounds. But it also could be people who were raised just with, it's not okay if you fail. You must succeed, and they don't feel good about themselves if that happens.
Why is it good to acknowledge your imperfections? I think it is a good idea.
Well, I hate it myself. I don't know about you. Well, certainly if you acknowledge a couple of levels. One is if you acknowledge your imperfections, other people are willing to acknowledge their imperfections. So one of the things that I do when I coach people, whether it's about abrasiveness or whatever, is again, tipping my hat to Marshall Goldsmith, who invented something called feed forward, which is what this is to go to your key stakeholders and say, you know, I've gotten some feedback that I need to speak up more, or I've gotten some feedback that I need to be better at listening to people, or whatever it is. And then say, do you think I'm working on the right thing? And if the other person says yes, then you say, well, what do you want to see from me? What behavior would you want to see from me so that you would rate me as really, really doing well? And just doing that, they're acting with humility. They're asking for the people who report to them or who are equal to them to be coaches. And they are a leader in the organization, so they're creating a new culture. So that's one of the reasons to admit that you have faults and imperfections and ask others, how can you deal with them better? The second reason is that if you don't do that, one of my coaches, one of the best pieces of advice I got as a leader was my coach said to me at one point, look, there's one thing that you're going to do or I'm going to quit. And that is, before you tell anybody what they're going to do, you ask them, why won't it work? And he said to me, you know, if you're going to tell the janitor to change how the janitor picks up the garbage, the janitor gets to tell you why it won't work. You're going to tell the receptionist to change how the receptionist answers the phone, receptionist gets to tell you why it won't work. And when I started to do that, first of all, I had been with him for about 4 months, and he was very frustrated with me because I wasn't hearing. And it wasn't until he did that, until he took that tone of voice, that I heard him. So by the way, that's another reason that abrasive executives sometimes don't get it, because you haven't told them so that they could hear it. And so I started doing it, and it was amazing to me what the people around me knew in my system that I didn't know. And his name was Louis Spain, and his family, he liked me mentioning him. He passed away this year from cancer. So I'm tipping my hat to him, but boy, Louis just gave me one of the best pieces of advice ever. So those are the two reasons for admitting that you don't know everything.
I have to say, when one of the companies I work with, the CEO was ready to fire the office manager who had once been the bookkeeper, and she was just in the wrong position. Mm-hmm. And she'd been with him for 30 years. And I said, you're the one that made the mistake of moving her out of the position she was successful into a position that she was not suited for. And it's not fair to fire her. So I said to him, you need to apologize to her in front of everybody. And, yes. And amazingly, he did it. And the women in his office started crying. And it changed the whole dynamic with him, the whole relationship.
Yeah,
so admitting this is very, very powerful. What strategies should you use to handle a bully boss?
Well, there's managing yourself, and then there's how do you relate to the boss. So in managing yourself, first of all, you've got to challenge your judgment of them. So most people, even I do, I mean, I am one of them, and I have a tendency to use demeaning names when I refer to other people. So part of it is to develop compassion, which means recognizing that just like you, the other person is an imperfect human being, and that there are good things underneath it. Also to understand their wiring. So you need to figure out whether you've got one of that small group of people who enjoys causing pain and just doesn't care about other people, or you've got one of those people who really doesn't want to hurt people, but is reacting defensively or just talking out of their family and ethnic culture. So after you get that clear, that's to figure out whether it's personal or not. The next piece is you have to look at your own self-esteem and determine whether or not you evaluate yourself based on whether other people are talking nicely to you. And the way I like to talk about it is, are you a target or are you a victim? And we tend to talk about people being victims of abuse or bullying or what have you. And the reality is that they're not. They're targets. And how they react to it, very much going back to Man's Search for Meaning. There were people in the concentration camps who took care of other people when they were hurting. Everybody was in the same boat, but they took care of other people when they were hurting. The third thing is that I think that you need to know that you have choices so that you're not stuck. So it really is helpful to know that you can leave if you want to. And by the way, when I work with people around this, I'm not suggesting to them that they should leave, because very often there are very good reasons why they would want to stay in terms of their long-term benefits, et cetera. But they need to know that they could leave. They need to be checking that out. And what happens when you know that you can leave, you're making a choice rather than you are forced to be here. And then finally, there's an approach that I use, partly comes from the Center for Creative Leadership, which is called Situation Behavior Impact. And it's partly mine, which is if you frame things correctly, you can say almost anything to anyone. So if you, Mark, are my boss and you're one of those people and you tell me to do something and I know it won't work, the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to listen to you. And at a certain point, I'm going to say, Mark, I really want to represent you. So there are things you're saying I'm not quite getting. Is it okay if I ask you a bunch of questions? Now, the words are one down, one up. I'm here to serve you. But the tone of voice is equal. Now, let's say you fill me in. Usually you're going to tell me, and then I'm going to leave. I'm going to spend some time, maybe an hour, 2 hours. Then I'm going to come back and I'm going to say, Mark, I wouldn't be doing my job. And by the way, I'm using some extreme language here to be clear, but I wouldn't necessarily say it exactly this way. Mark, I wouldn't be doing my job serving you if I didn't let you know that there are some things that could happen that will not be winners for us if I do what you ask. Do you want to hear it? Again, tone of voice is equal, even one up. If you tell me no, I'm going to leave and go do it. So basically, that very powerful communication from the one down, one up, the in service to you position. Similar, we had some communication before the interview today about martial arts. It's similar to the soft martial arts versus the hard martial arts.
We're going to talk about that. Let me ask you, what do you do for elite military operators? What do you work on with them?
Yeah, so I want to say about 5 years ago, a friend of mine asked me if I had heard about the Honor Foundation. I had not. The Honor Foundation at the time was an organization that was a nonprofit organization that helped Navy SEALs transition from the Navy to civilian life. They now have expanded and they serve all the special operators. And they have one of the most incredible programs I've seen for military transition. So I am a volunteer executive coach for them. And that's only 1/3 of the program. They have something like 60 hours of classroom. They take them on, well, certainly with COVID, it's not happening so much, but they take them on treks to meet people. They get interviews. But part of the job of the coach is, number one, the first piece is, what is your why? And they use Simon Sinek's model. And the reason they do that is that in the Special Operations Forces, there is no I, it's what we did. And you can't go into an interview and ask, what did you do? You can't go into a business interview and ask, what did you do? And say, well, we did this, et cetera. They need, you need to be able to speak a different language. So a big piece of what I do with them is help them translate what they did into business language and into what did they do. Another piece is practicing interviews and helping them with their resumes and stuff like that. My skill is more in that first piece. And so we have a team, we call it Poacher Coach. So we have 100 coaches. Some of them are much better at writing resumes and at doing interviews and connecting. And so we pass them around to each other and help them move that. My understanding was, and I can't remember the exact number, but when Joe Musselman started the Honor Foundation, something like 18% of special operations people had jobs or planned for life when they left. Several years later, they've had about 1,000, I think it's 900 graduates, and their rate is that people who are graduates of that program, about 95% of them have made a decision about what they want to do with their life and are satisfied with it. So it's an incredible program.
One of the questions we were asked by someone who's listening in is they ask, women get labeled as a bitch and often
Yes.
gets them redlined in their careers. Can you please tell us how the things that you're talking about applies to women?
Well, women have a special problem because I believe in our society, and there's certainly lots of writing about this, that men can do something and it's okay, and women get called names for the same behavior. It can be helpful for women sometimes, and I hesitate to say this. I have a number of different people that I know who work with women around how do you communicate in a heavily male environment. And one of the recommendations was that they use language like this, as opposed to that's my area and being territorial, which men can do and get away with, that they say things like, I will make that happen for you. And again, it has tone of voice versus words. The words are somewhat, I'm in service to you. Tone of voice is heavier, but I think that's changing somewhat these days, but not enough.
Tell us, what is the warrior's self-assessment, and what may be the three most important parts of that are to be a great leader?
So what I did for the warrior self-assessment is I took the Navy SEALs ethos and I abstracted about 15 items from it. And I basically ask in the book, how do you compare? So do you have an uncommon need for or desire for success? And there's some conversation around what that means, but most of the people who are warriors, who are no bullshit executives, the people around them, even high performers, wonder where they get the energy. A second category would be, do you step in, take charge, and lead your team? Again, that can get you in trouble, but that's a tendency that they have. Do you always accomplish the mission? Are you never out of the fight? Those kinds of things. At the tail end of the ethos, though, are things like humbly serve, protect people who can't protect themselves, control your emotions regardless of circumstance, those kinds of things. And those are the things that are typically missing. And part of the reason that I use the Navy SEALs ethos is because those are the most respected warriors on the planet. And so most of the people who write about abrasive executives tell them that they have to be nicer people, that they're not good people. And then you get into the argument, is this politically correct? Is it that, why shouldn't I be able to talk like this? And I think it's, number one, better and more helpful to recognize that they're incredibly valuable, that we need their warrior spirit. And by the way, I'm going to challenge you to be even a better warrior, because you're not as good a warrior as you could be. And so that is the nature of the assessment.
You talked about special forces given the leeway to make decisions as circumstances changed. Why and wasn't it always being done that way?
Yeah, so by the way, one of the books I would recommend for your audience is General Stanley McChrystal's Team of Teams. And when he took over our forces after the Iraq War, we were getting our butts kicked by Al Qaeda. And part of the reason for that, and this is a highly encapsulated description, part of the reason for that was that we had a very top-down set of hierarchy. So if you set a group of SEALs in, or a group of Marine Raiders, or just Army folk, they were told, do this. When they got there, there was a large potential that Al Qaeda had figured out something else to do. And they were not allowed to shift. They had to then report back and say, this is what's going on. And it often took 2 to 3 days or longer for them to get a response, by which time the information that they gave back was not even valuable. So General McChrystal started a process where he would have a phone call in the morning. And if I remember correctly, there was something like 7,000 people on the line from all countries, from all of the branches of service, from government. And the first part of the conversation was, you know, what's going on that's critical? What do we need to deal with today? What's the most urgent? After they decided that, and that might take 15 minutes or a half hour, everybody who wasn't part of that got off. But everybody heard it. Everybody knew what was going on all over the place and understood how everything was connected. So then they would decide, here's what we're going to do. And that would take another half hour to hour and a half or so. They went from what I remember was they went from, it took 9 days to launch a plane, to 90 minutes, that in 90 minutes they could actually come up with a plan and do something about it. And we got much more effective. And he talks about in his book that that really applies to business as well. If you've got people in a multinational organization who are all over the world, and you're doing top-down strategy, and they can't make decisions, they are you're much less likely to be effective than if you give them permission to make the strategic decisions. However, you can't go on need to know. Everybody needs to know what's going on everywhere else so that they can actually make the strategic decisions.
A good book to read is Startup Nation, about Israel's entrepreneurial culture. And in their military, the lieutenants make all the decisions and they're supported by the generals. So they make the decisions upon impact, which has driven their entrepreneurial culture. It's a great book to go read.
Yes.
You mentioned, please talk about agile and lean methodologies for managing projects and people.
Yeah, so I got introduced to lean, it was called continuous process improvement back then, by Louis Spain, who, as I mentioned, was my coach. And the assumption is that most of what goes wrong in organizations is caused by problems in the system rather than people. So here I am at the top of the organization and stuff is not working and I'm getting irritated with people. Why didn't you figure it out, et cetera, et cetera. And I met Louis, he was dating a friend of mine. And we started to talk and I just got fascinated about the whole thing. So he had me read a book called The Goal by Eli Goldratt. And I actually hate reading. I'm a little bit ADHD when it comes to reading. And I decided I'd read a chapter one Sunday night. Started at 10 o'clock at night, I'd read a chapter, and 6 in the morning, I finished the book. And called up my boss, the owner of the company, and said, you know, Nick, I'm not coming in this morning because I was up reading all night, but trust me, I did a whole lot more for you than I might have done otherwise. Nick read the book, we decided to hire Louis. So to give you a feel for how it worked and what he did, one of the things he did was he had our staff, and it was at all levels, graph out the processes. And it started with, we were a healthcare company, we're doing employee assistance programs. So it started with, the phone rings, that was step one. Number two, the receptionist picks up the phone, and it took them a good 2 months to graph, flowchart all of the steps all the way to the end. And so one day the medical records person, Lynn, who was another tough cookie like me, comes in with her arms folded and she says, I want you to come into the conference room. I have something to show you. And trust me, I did not want to go, but I went. And she started with the phone rings and started taking me around. And we get to a certain point and she says, and then I do this. I said, well, why do you do that? And she says, because you told me to do that. I told you to do that? I would never tell you to do that. And she said, don't you remember that situation where the clinician had died and we didn't have the clinician's closing notes and we worked out a way about how we were going to close the case and all of that? And I said, yeah, but Lynn, that was a workaround. I didn't want you to do that with everybody. And she said, well, you didn't say that. And the abrasive person in me was ready to say, what are you, an idiot? But by that time, Louis had beat me over the head enough that that's not okay. And what I said was, you're absolutely right. It was my job to make sure that that everyone understood what the process is. So that's a sense of lean, is understanding that everybody knows the process, that you need to, that most of it is coming from the process. You need to be able to delegate down permission to change the process when it needs to be changed.
Well, too bad you didn't meet Matt Butler, one of our sponsors, because I'm going to have Matt do a seminar for us on exactly what you just spoke about just now. Matt's a genius at mapping out these kinds of problems and figuring out a great process and the solution for it.
Yes.
Please explain the concepts of hard and soft power with examples of how they work.
Yeah, so the term comes from, and I know you've got the name there. I have a tendency when I'm in the middle of interviews to block on names. It was Joseph Nair or something like that, who wrote a book on international politics. And it was really about the idea that hard power, which is threatening other countries and you're going to do this, is not, well, there are times that you need to do that, but it's not as effective all the time without soft power. And soft power is more cooperative, nurturing, helpful, etc. So in the workplace, hard power is focus on goals, holding people accountable, drive for success, improve efficiency, all of that stuff. The other end is empathy, helping people, developing people, coaching, supporting, and all of that. And in my mind, in our leadership discussion today, I think we've kind of done a pendulum swing to the left towards soft power. That there's some conversation out there that you'll see that everyone should feel accepted and respected and safe all the time. And I think actually if you're on one side or the other of that, you're going to create some unintended negative consequences. So if you're only on the hard power, you're going to end up not hearing, as you said earlier, you're not going to hear from your people. They're going to know what's wrong and they're not going to tell you. If you're only over on the soft power, it's going to be hard for you to approach people who are not performing and let them know that they're not performing, and perhaps even let people go when they need to be let go, or get them into the right positions. And what happens if you do too much soft power is that your high performers start getting annoyed with you and dispirited. If you do too much hard power, the same thing happens. People start feeling disrespected and sometimes you get sabotaged. So it's being able to balance those two things out.
Very hard for some people to do, hence why they need others around them to balance that out. And watching the Michael Jordan documentary made that obvious.
Yes.
And one of the things I thought was very interesting, I guess General McChrystal read about this earlier and helped form his own thinking, which was, could you please talk about the hen experiment and what leaders can learn?
Yes, the hen experiment, one of my favorites. So I attended I am a licensed clinical social worker, and I don't do that anymore, but I keep my license new. So I have to take 36 credits of continuing ed every 2 years. And I attended this program, a training program for CEUs, and the trainer presented a case that he called the badass chickens. And what that was is someone, I think his name was William Muir, who was a professor at Purdue, and he specialized in breeding, and he was trying to breed hens that laid more eggs. And so he had two conditions. One is he had hens, he put hens in, I think there were 9 in a cage or 7 in a cage, and he put them in 2 separate groups. In one group, he identified the hens that laid the most eggs. And he took those hens out and then bred them, and then looked at who in that group laid the most eggs. And he did that for like 6 generations. So 6 generations later, he had been taking out the highest producers in each group. In the other, he looked at which groups of hens laid the most eggs and then bred them. And so in the groups of hens, there tended to be a mixture of hens who laid a lot of eggs and hens that didn't. But for some reason or other, those groups laid more eggs. And 6 generations down, he showed some pictures of the hens. The hens who were the high layers, if you saw a picture of them, they were fighting with each other. They were pulling each other's feathers out. Their egg production dropped. And usually one hen was the bully in the group, the highest producing hen. And the other groups were just getting along just fine. So the metaphor for me is really that often people who are abrasive leaders or very driven leaders make the mistake of thinking that if everybody were like me, we would have better production, and that's not true. You need people who do a variety of things. As you're saying, you need people who do the empathy and who do the connection and who are more analytic. If everybody were like you, you'd be in big trouble.
You talked about an article in Inc. magazine about the characteristics of a great team. What are they, and does that hold true for all endeavors?
Yeah, so I knew I wasn't going to remember that, so I decided to pull it out and write it down. Yeah, there were 5 things. One is dependability. So it really has to do with what's the culture of the team. There was some Google research on what makes great teams. And ultimately, it's not about the people in the team in some way, are they loud, are they soft? It's really about how it's really about the unspoken rules. And so number 1 was dependability. So if people say they're going to do something, they do it. So that's one of the keys, that you have a culture in your team where that is true. The second thing is that everybody knows what the goals are and everybody knows what the structure is. It's amazing to me how many times I've worked with teams and asked, in a group, what's the purpose of the team? And everybody has a different answer. And the team has been together for 2-3 years. The third thing is that they care about each other, that there's some meaning. And so, and that's connected with impact. So it's meaning and impact. So is there some reason? Impact is our work important? Very often in highly busy organizations, people are said, do this. People are told do this, or a team is told do this, but they don't see the whole value chain, and they don't understand how what they're doing helps the person who's closer to the external customer on the value chain. They just don't get why they're doing what they're doing. And so some of it just feels like rote and silly stuff to do. And finally, psychological safety, which is the ability to be yourself. And psychological safety really is one of the big things these days in the literature on teams and effectiveness in general. And that is it safe for somebody to make a mistake? Is it safe to express an opinion? Is it safe to disagree with you, etc.? So those are the 5.
And you can't get people to be honest with you if they're always afraid about making mistakes. And
exactly.
And they're not going to go take smart chances.
Yeah.
Charles Darwin said the most important instinct for survival that you write in your book is sympathy. Why is that?
So my understanding of what Darwin meant by sympathy is, as I've read it, and I have to admit, going into this, I'm somewhat hesitant because I haven't read Darwin in real depth. Like most of what I got is from a PhD named Joel Barker, who was very famous back in about 10 years ago, 15 years ago in the leadership realm. And he talked about Darwin being, that it was attributed to Darwin that the term survival of the fittest. And he said, really, Darwin didn't say that. Darwin said survival of the fit, which is a very different term. So many people who are abrasive and high achievers believe that, it's survival of the fit, that, you should be able to handle it. And he pointed out, Joe Barker pointed out that Darwin did not mean who can kill other people, who's bigger than other people. Darwin, for instance, meant that there are bugs that live on bears that have adapted to it. He meant adaptation, the ability to adapt. And then he took it further and he talked about the fact that human beings would not survive if they didn't, and the reason I say empathy rather than sympathy is he was talking about parenting and how parents take care of children. So there would not have been new generations of people without parents taking care of their children under very dangerous circumstances. So that is what he meant. And so in terms of the workplace, one of the things, again, the Navy SEALs is to protect people who can't protect themselves and care enough about people that you're going to protect them.
How does compassion help you be a strong leader?
Well, let's define compassion. About 5 years ago, a friend of mine who was the head of an employee assistance program for one of the big healthcare companies, who was also got about 25 years of training in Buddhist meditation, called me up one day and he said, Stanford's doing this program on compassion cultivation, which is based on the Dalai Lama's teaching. It's also based on some of the neuroscience research that we have on the brain. And I'm one of the first people who's been certified in it. Would you like to come in and, I'm doing a pilot run. And I was sort of like, is this a trick question? So I thought I would show up and hear a few things. I'm a therapist. I've been doing this stuff for years. I'm a leader, got lots of training. I thought I would learn a few new techniques. Changed my life, not completely, but made a very big difference. So the definition of compassion is recognizing that someone else is in pain, which is empathy, in pain or suffering, and at the same time having an urge to do something to alleviate that suffering. So I want to be really clear. Compassion does not mean letting people off the hook. It doesn't mean treating them like children, but it means recognizing that they are human beings who are suffering and who are imperfect just like you. And then there are 3 levels to what is a compassionate response. The first is the commitment that no matter what my brain is telling me, that, and a lot of times we have this conversation in our head that, you don't deserve respect. You didn't do your work, whatever it is. You're not telling the truth. You don't deserve respect. Is to cultivate respect for people that it's difficult for us to have respect for. So that's the commitment. The next thing is, what are the words? And the last thing is actually feeling compassion and connection with people. Of the 3, the commitment is the most important. So what I have found for myself is that there are times I made the commitment to do it, and there are times I'm in the middle of something and my brain is telling me, call him an idiot. But no, I have made that commitment. And when I do go over the line, I practice it. So what could I have said differently? So I build new neural pathways in my brain to help me the next time. Sort of like athletics. The more you practice, the better you get at it.
I got 2 more questions for you. How do you make sure you don't disrespect someone you don't have respect for? I thought that was interesting.
Yeah. Well, again, it goes back to commitment. So if I have the time, if I'm not caught in the moment, and I have somebody that I'm angry at and I'm having a lot of conversation in my head about, one of the things I do is call up one of my partners or somebody that I trust, and I run it out. And what I do is it has to be completely confidential and it has to be completely safe, where I can tell them exactly what's going on in my mind in the most politically incorrect way possible. And as I get all of that stuff out, then I go down to my core and I try to figure out, what is it in me that's gotten so offended? What is it about this that I'm so offended by? And usually there's gold under there. So if you try to be too polite up front, you never understand what you're really, what's really pushing you. And so once I do that, I realize I can reframe it in a more positive way. It's really about commitment. It's really about respect. It's really about integrity. And then I work on how am I going to say it. And if I practice it 3 or 4 times, I'm usually a lot better. So the part of the idea is that you never get rid of that conversation in your brain that's saying, call him an idiot. But it's up here, you're up here and you're looking down and saying, thank you for sharing. I've chosen to go another direction.
Yeah, and it's tough to be authentic doing that as well, as opposed to being also patronizing when you do that.
Well, if your commitment to treat people with compassion is authentic, then it is authentic. So for me, I realized that it was no longer okay for me, that people deserved respect regardless of whether I thought they deserved respect, because they were human beings. And once I made that commitment, my brain's conversation turned out to be wrong, is now wrong. It's like, I know, brain, you're trying to be helpful, but I've made another decision. So that makes it authentic for me.
My last question for you is, can bad impressions be turned around? And if so, how's it done?
Yeah, so great question. I can tell you there are 2 ways. One is with an apology. And it's not just, I'm sorry. In my book, I have a 7-step apology. Again, I can never remember all the steps exactly, but the key of it is being able to say, I recognize that I did this. I recognize that I hurt you in this way. I am making a commitment to change. This is what I'm going to do, so that you're doing it. It's more than just, I'm sorry. The other way is, if you are an executive and you recognize that you have been seen as overly abrasive, or on the other hand, if you're an executive and you've been seen as conflict avoidant, either or, you do the feed forward process. You acknowledge it. You go to your stakeholders and say, I know that I have been experienced as abrasive or passive aggressive or whatever, and my goal is to change. What do you think I need to do? And usually you need an outside person to help you, because it's hard to change your brain's neural pathways by yourself. But that would be the pinch, is admit it, get internal market research about what they need to hear from you, acknowledge it, and work on it.
Jordan, you were worth the wait. And we're glad we had you on today, and your book was fantastic to read. I think people who pick it up and start reading will go through what you did, which is sit through it and read it throughout the night. And we wish you luck with the sales of this book, and we hope you'll write something else, and we'll have you back again.
Thank you so much. It's been a real honor to be on the show, and my apology for being late.
Not a problem. Enjoy the rest of your day. Everybody have a great weekend, and thank you so much for coming today. Take care.